Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Ned Blackhawk, a professor of history and American studies at Yale. His field of interest is American Indian history, and he's the author of Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, a study of the American Great Basin that garnered numerous professional prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians. He has also published numerous state-of-the-field essays for many of America's leading professional historical associations and has helped to build the newly established Native American Cultural Center here at Yale. Today, we'll talk with Professor Blackhawk about the Yale Group for the Study of Native America and his broader work to institutionalize Native American studies. Welcome, Professor Blackhawk.
It's very nice to be here.
Let's start with an overview of the Yale's Group for the Study of Native America. Tell us about it and its mission.
The Yale Group for the Study of Native America is an interdisciplinary working group on campus. We refer to it as YIGSNA, the kind of acronym, and it provides a permanent space and kind of community for the study of Native America that draws upon Yale's largely graduate student, but also faculty and staff interest in this subject.
And what's its mission?
Our goal is to provide a supportive, inclusive, and advanced scholarly community for interested participants who need or want to share their work with a professional audience of some form, and to provide even more so a kind of community around campus on these issues. That draws from various professional schools. We have a lot of law students, from various academic graduate programs, and also from an increasing number of faculty on campus interested in these subjects.
And how long has it been on campus here?
It was founded in 2003 by a group of concerned graduate students that Yale, like many other private institutions at the time, didn't have a very prominent kind of scholarly profile in the field of not just American Indian history, which is my field of study, but also Native American legal studies, Native American literary studies, ethnographic work, art history, and other types of academic fields of inquiry. These students really kind of heroically built a institutional space, secured funding for annual conferences, and set in motion some of the pressure on the administration to begin the process of hiring academic faculty in the fields.
And what are some of the projects that you're working on with the group?
We're doing lots of things, so it's really quite exciting. We run a bi-monthly working group that meets in the newly established Native American Cultural Center. We showcase emergent works in the field from some of our graduate students who are finishing dissertation chapters or research projects, doing initial kind of publications. We sponsor lots of academic talks and events on campus. This year alone, we've done 2 very large, at least in organization, conferences that have drawn collectively around 100 people to campus from across North America on various kind of academically themed subjects. We also run a dissertation writing fellowship named after one of Yale's most illustrious early 20th century Native American graduates named Henry Rocloud. This fellowship brings a visiting graduate student to campus for the year to finish their dissertation, and is drawn from an international pool of applicants. And we provide the kind of scholarly community in which this fellow does their academic work and then presents it to an academic audience. We also run, not so much as a working group, but many of us are involved in other Native American studies efforts on campus and at Yale, including the running of a university press series with Yale in American Indian Studies.
Are there a number of these kinds of groups at universities and colleges across the country, or not so many?
Well, Yale is kind of a very active academic community. So it has lots of comparable or heavily institutionalized academic working communities. There's this famous one that you're probably familiar with in agrarian studies, run by James Scott.
Yes.
I have colleagues in the history department who've run sets of these working groups. So when I arrived here about 6 or 7 years ago, I began that, well, I worked with people who were involved in that earlier phases of this group and helped secure kind of permanent resources for it. So we're not unique here in a sense, except that we're the only group on campus that does Native American studies, but we are in fact the only, to my knowledge, professional academic working group of its kind across any of the kind of leading private institutions in North America.
Okay, that's wonderful.
It is, but it's also kind of sad in the sense that there aren't that many other advanced communities in this field at our kind of cognizant peer institutions.
Right, right. So the Cultural Center, tell us about that. What is it comprised of?
The Native American Cultural Center is becoming one of the most enriching places on campus, I think. I think it's not unfair to kind of use that very strong characterization to describe this really vibrant, largely undergraduate student community, but very active and close academic community on campus. It's one of the 4 cultural centers on campus that is designed to provide a secure and supportive community for underrepresented students of color, in this case Native American students and indigenous students from across largely North America. We have Alaska Native students, Native Hawaiian students, and nearly a record number of American Indian undergraduates at the moment.
And how many would that be?
I think we're graduating 50 self-identified Native American students this year, which is nearly 4% of the entire student body, or graduating class.
That's pretty amazing, actually.
It is, and it reflects a kind of growing institutional concern and interest in these areas. The center is only 2 years old now, so it has really kind of state-of-the-art seminar space and kitchen and other types of amenities. And one of the really most exciting things is that there were once only 1 or 2 really active Native American student groups on campus, and now we have 8 or 9.
Wow.
Both undergraduate and graduate students. And all of them generally use the center as the site for their meetings and a lot of their events.
And are they broken out by basically different parts of the country in terms of the Native American nation that they're affiliated with?
Less so. There are some, at some institutions there will be like a Native Hawaiian group or a Navajo student community club or some kind of association. These groups are kind of organized around student interests in things like health, or our law students have a group, or our Native American graduate students have an active group. The working group is another group that's affiliated in part with the center. But the undergraduates also have a drumming group or community.
So it's more than just centered around the artistic part of Native Americans.
Correct. It's really a academic as well as kind of scholarly and social community.
Great. So where would you like to see the Cultural Center go in the next 5 years? What would be your hope?
It'd be really nice to see a few more additional Native American faculty on campus.
Are you the only one at this moment?
In Yale College.
Okay.
And it'd be really nice to see some more kind of collaborative partnerships between campus and other Native American either institutional programs or even communities themselves out in Indian country. And we've done a few really interesting collaborations with the Mohegan Nation here in Connecticut. We've had events at the Pequot Museum also here in Connecticut. And have recently hired a few Native American community leaders from across campus to work with us in various ways.
Okay, very good. Let's talk about your academic work. You recently completed an anthology with Isaiah Wilner called Indigenous Visions, Rediscovering the World of Franz Boas. Let's tell us about Franz Boas, who he is, and then let's talk a little bit about the anthology and what it grew out of.
The legacy of anthropology in the field of American Indian Studies is really hard to overestimate or overemphasize. Anthropology as a kind of scholarly field emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century and really had as its primary subjects of inquiry indigenous communities, largely in North America. And the kind of leading proponent or the kind of institutional founder of that discipline was a German ethnologist by the name of Franz Boas, who migrated out of Germany in the late 1800s and traveled around North America. And eventually helped organize like incredibly extensive cultural exhibitions, like at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, and eventually worked for decades in New York City, institutionalizing the discipline of anthropology at Columbia University, and also building like the New York's Natural History Museum, and then training dozens and dozens of future anthropologists, many of whom would study native languages and begin recording what they thought were disappearing cultural practices, and really help establish a kind of academic vernacular and kind of institutional understanding of the peoples of the world, in which Native Americans were usually either the sentiment or the kind of primary ethnographically identifiable other to Western society's emergent sense of its own subjectivity. So we have this very robust now community of graduate students here, one of whom is writing an academic dissertation on not just Boas, but particularly the Native American communities that shaped and informed him. And he very relatively early on in his graduate training decided he'd like to do a big conference. And so using our YIXNA working group and working with MacMillan, where we held the event, we brought together dozens of scholars for a few days and really interrogated the relative place, not only of Boas as a kind of ethnographic influencer of subsequent scholarly debates, but particularly those who shaped him.
Okay.
And so the world around him. And we came to a really kind of firm understanding that we shouldn't think of these intellectual leaders in certain scholarly fields as being singular figures, but having been deeply imprinted by particularly their native informants. So we spent quite a bit of time working with these visiting scholars and soliciting extended papers from them, and have compiled them into a volume that really rethinks the legacy of not just, in a sense, Boas, but really of American anthropological thought.
And so what are some of the conclusions that came out of it?
Well, a kind of primacy of, one of the kind of primary conclusions is that the world in which anthropologists were forming their ideas about native peoples was not something that they alone were constructing, and that there are many attempts both here and also globally where various ethnographic informants were trying to, in a sense, articulate a certain social or kind of cultural or even political vision through the discourse of ethnography. To, in a sense, have the ethnographer understand their concerns and potentially bring them to other colonial or imperial officials, or help redress the levels of, say, cultural censorship that they were experiencing. So Boas was most famous for working among the Northwest Coast indigenous communities, particularly in British Columbia. And those communities at the time he was there, and at the time he brought them or helped bring them to Chicago, were undergoing very heavy persecution of their cultural and religious practices. And so they saw in him an ally who could help articulate a vision of their cultural organization to outsiders at a time when government officials and missionaries and various kind of institutions of the state were heavily prosecuting them. So we are looking at the kind of dynamic agency that indigenous peoples have been able to deploy at various times through these sets of ethnographic encounters.
Right, right. And how do you think that would apply to Native America today?
Well, I think it's relevant to think of indigenous peoples as having been very active participants in the making of both the intellectual structures that have historically under-recognized them, as well as the larger societies around them.
Right.
So the idea that museums or scholarly textbooks or children's literature convey that these peoples are without history or primitive or somehow inherently different is in fact a kind of message that Native peoples have been contesting for generations.
Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
It's been a pleasure.
For more information about Professor Blackhawk and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.